Hello and welcome to Lawfiscal. And today we are going to discuss about Transfer of Property Act 1882. Definitions, that is Interpretation Clause Section 3 of Transfer of Property Act. In definitions we have immovable property, attested, attestation, actionable claim and notice. These are the definitions that we need to know before we study Transfer of Property Act in detail. So let's look at what is an immovable property. So now immovable property. So property consists of two kinds, movable and immovable property. Now what is a property? We all have properties, one kind or the other. For example, if we live in a house, that is a property. We use our vehicle for traveling, that is also a property. But house is an immovable property, but the vehicle that we use is a movable property. So something like that for the easy understanding. To be very precise, what is a movable property is a property can be transferred from one place to another with human efforts. If a human being or if we can transfer it so easily from one place to another, we call it as a movable property. And the next one is an immovable property. So the property which cannot be transferred from one place to another without causing damage to the property. For example, if we can transfer a house after demolishing or after destroying the house, that doesn't mean that it is a movable property. So it should not cause any damage to the property while transferring. Okay, so that is the definition of an immovable property. So let's discuss in detail about immovable property, as most of the provisions in the Transfer of Property Act are related to the immovable property. So what is an immovable property? The law clearly defines what is an immovable property. An immovable property does not include, law always says in a negative way. So immovable property does not include standing timber, growing crops and grass. So it says what is not a immovable property. So that means standing timber, growing crops and grass generally are a movable property. So now we have to know what the law means by standing timber. Standing timber is trees fit for use, building, repairing houses. So you don't have to think about standing timber. Anything can be a movable property which can be used for building and repairing houses, and it should be tree fit for use. It should be a tree fit for use. Okay, and that tree we use it for building or repairing houses and things like that. Such thing we call it as standing timber. Next one is growing crops. All vegetable growth which have no existence apart from what they produce. For example, pan leaves, sugarcane, etc. Sugarcane has only one use. We use the sugarcane for making sugar. We cannot make furniture with sugarcane. So the sugarcane has no existence apart from what they produce. So if anything has no existence from what they produce, such all vegetable growth are related to growing crops. Then grass. What is grass? Used as a food for cattle or other livestock. Fodder. Fodder is a dry kind of grass. So, so we have seen what is not an immovable property. Now, if you look at General Laws Act, Section 3K26, we can see a comprehensive definition of immovable property. So what is an immovable property? So immovable property shall include land, benefits arising out of land, and things attached to the earth. This is a very important concept that we have to understand for solving some problems. The first one is land. Any land is a immovable property. That we already know. Benefits arising out of land. For example, if we get any benefits out of that land, any agricultural thing or anything, any benefit that we are getting out of that land, that all considered as a immovable property. We give that land for rent, we get the rent, that also considered as immovable property. So this you have to keep in mind, benefits arising out of land will be an immovable property. The next one, things attached to the earth. Things attached to the earth means it is fixed permanently. That is why it is called things attached to the earth, not for a temporary purpose. So anything attached to the earth, we can call it as immovable property. So this is a very important definition. If you know this concept clearly, all the problems related to it can be solved easily. We know land is a immovable property. So what law defines a land? Land, the law defines as it covers the upper surface of the earth and also things below it. So whatever you see is not only land, whatever underneath maybe you cannot see, that also termed as a land. For example, minerals. All the minerals we know, it is under the sand, under the land. So that will be also part of a movable property. We may collect minerals from a land and we can take it from with human efforts, but it is not considered as a movable property. It is still an immovable property. A well, it is dug on a land, it is a immovable property. Tube well, rivers, we may think that water is flowing through the river, so it may be a movable property, but it is not, because it is on the land, it becomes a immovable property. Ponds, tanks, streams, canal, dug on surface of natural or artificial, everything comes as a immovable property. So now, any right in these or in respect of these or any other interest in it are all immovable property. So this is a very confusing concept. Sometimes when we face problems, we may have a right to take water from a river. We may think that it is a movable property, but it is not. Even though we can take water from a river easily with human efforts, it is not movable. It is an immovable property. That is a right to take water. It becomes an immovable property. In respect of these ponds, streams, minerals, if we have a right to take some minerals from a land, it comes under immovable property. Or any other interest in it, it all comes under immovable property. So this concept has to be very clear. So the next one is benefit arising out of land. You might be already knowing it because since you already know the concept. So right to receive future rent is an immovable property because the rent from the land, it's a right, so it is also an immovable property. So future rent, example for a future rent, rent from house, shops, jagir, etc. Right to collect lag, leaves, other things from forest trees, because forest is land, it is a immovable property, and we have a right to collect something from the forest, that all comes under immovable property. And revenue from agriculture. Revenue, agriculture, we know it's in the land and we are taking revenue from agriculture. It also comes under immovable property. I hope it is very clear now. Now the third option, things attached to the earth. What is things attached to the earth? It is an immovable property. So things rooted on earth, for example, can be anything, but it does not include standing timber, growing crops and grass, because we know standing timber, growing crops and grass are rooted to the earth actually. So the law specifically tells that it is not included with the definition of things rooted to the earth. Now things embedded in earth, that is walls, building, minerals, they are all immovable property that we already know. Things fastened for permanent beneficial enjoyment of anything embedded to earth. Here we have to take a look at it. Permanent beneficial enjoyment. We may fasten something to the earth temporarily. That does not come here. Anything fastened or fixed, permanent enjoyment, they all comes under immovable property. For example, if a window kept permanently, it is a immovable property. Door kept permanently, it becomes an immovable property. Ceiling fan, it kept permanently, it becomes an immovable property. So we are also looking at Indian Registration Act because Transfer of Property Act tells you what is not immovable property. But when you look at Indian Registration Act 1908 section 26 along with it, it tells you what is an immovable property. So a land, building, hereditary allowances that you get it from the ancestors, right of ways, lights, ferries, fisheries, all comes under immovable property. But it does not include standing timber, growing crops and grass. Maybe we have to, one more definition that we have to understand, it's very important. What is an immovable property and movable property? Say for example, ceiling fan or any object. How can you define it is an immovable property or movable property? What comes to your mind? Please think. A ceiling fan, it has to become an immovable property when? When it is fixed for permanent beneficial enjoyment. The condition is permanent beneficial enjoyment. Now, when a ceiling fan become a movable property, it meant for a temporary purpose. For example, we have seen many types, many pandals for any convention or all that in the open ground. We may have to fit ceiling fan on the pandal. It does not comes under immovable property. At that time, ceiling fan is movable property. But a ceiling fan, if you fit inside a house where you don't unscrew it every time, it becomes an immovable property. So you have to have that common sense to decide any object whether it is immovable or movable. And we already know standing timber, growing crops and grass are not immovable property. Well, the law says there are at times we can also consider standing timber, growing crops and grass as movable as well as immovable. So again we have to apply a little bit of logic. When standing timber, growing crops and grass becomes movable, when you are doing it for the current transaction, you have an agreement with somebody to take out the standing timber, growing crops or grass to the present at the right moment. You don't delay it for any other date. Right now, today, this day. So it becomes movable. But if the agreement or a contract is for the future transactions, you don't have to take it now. You have to take it on a later day. It becomes immovable. So that is what we have to consider when deciding standing timber, growing crops and grass becomes movable or immovable. So if, for example, if sale of trees to be cut and taken away immediately, it becomes movable property. If transaction extend to the future, it becomes immovable. So keep that in mind, it's very important. So let's look at some of the case laws related to it. The first, Marshall was green. Fruit bearing trees are immovable property as intention of the parties is that the fruit of the trees should be enjoyed, not the trees should be cut down. So here in this case, it is considered as an immovable property because the land is a immovable property. If you collect fruit bearing trees, it is the benefit arising out of land. So it is also becomes an immovable property. So hence fruit bearing trees will become as an immovable property. Okay, so very important. So next case, Sini Chettar was Shanthanathan. Right to cut trees for a period of 4 years related to immovable property, and it requires registration. Here the concept is anything that is immovable requires registration. If any property you consider it as an immovable property, and if you don't register it, then it becomes invalid. You cannot question before the court. And that is why it is important to consider a property whether it is immovable or movable. There is a different process for movable and immovable property. Here in this case, Sini Chettiar versus Shantanathan, right to cut trees for a period of 4 years. So when you talk about 4 years, it is not present. It is a future event after 4 years or period of 4 years, all related to the immovable property. Hence it requires registration. If there is no registration, then it becomes not law, or it cannot enforce it in the court of law. So the next case, Ansari versus Board of Revenue. Right to take away BD leaves, bamboos and standing timber over a period of 1 year was held to be immovable. Here again the question is whether it is going to take the right now or for the future date. Here the period of 1 year, the person has a right to take BD leaves and bamboos and standing timber. It becomes also immovable. And why it is immovable? Why there is so much of a specification of immovable? Because registration is required. If you have a right for BD leaves, bamboos and standing timber from any place over a period of some duration, you have to register such rights. That is why it is important. So next case, Ananda Behra versus State of Orissa. Right to catch fish from a lake, pond arising out of immovable property. Therefore, sale of right to catch fish from lake, pond requires registered instrument for its validity. It is under section 54 of Transfer of Property Act 1882. So, right to catch fish and carry fish is a profit prendere. Being arising out of land is a immovable property. So profit appendere is something that you get benefit arising out of land. It is a immovable property. So this all becomes very easy once you know that concept. Let's look at a problem. A orally grants B for rupees 700 the right to catch fish and carry fish from his lake. Is the grant valid? Look at it one more time. The first point is oral is it is not registered. Just said it. You can take fish worth rupees 700. So is this, we can have a contract orally or written, but here we have to consider this is carrying fish from a lake amounts to movable property or immovable property. So we already know the lake where it is on the land. So it becomes a immovable property. Hence registration is required, otherwise it will not be valid. So the first question, the above problem relates to the movable or immovable property. That is the first question that should come in our mind. The second is whether right over immovable property requires registration for validity. Yes, it requires. So the rule applies is General Clause Act 1897, Section 54 of Transfer of Property Act. So here, how do we write application? The sale may be oral. It's an example. There is a case. Ananda Behra was State of Orissa. We have seen that earlier. Such right is a benefit arising out of immovable property. Right. So it comes with the purview of immovable property under General Clause Act 1897. So we already know the lake is immovable property, and if you get a benefit arising from an immovable property, that is fish. Fish is a benefit from the lake. It also considered as immovable property. Since it is an immovable property, it requires a registered instrument for its validity under section 54 of Transfer of Property Act. So what is the decision? The decision is therefore the oral grant is invalid and cannot pass away title in favor of B. If you just say orally you can catch fish from that lake for worth rupees 700, that is an invalid agreement. So that won't stand. So we should know that. So let's quickly look into what is a movable property and immovable property. So first, movable property can be shifted from one place to another without any loss or damage. Second, what is immovable property? Which cannot be shifted, transported easily from one place to another without any loss or damage, example land, building, etc. And we already know much more definition about immovable property now. Registration of the transfer of movable property under Indian Registration Act 1908 is not compulsory but optional. Movable property, we don't really need to register it. But immovable property, registration of immovable property is compulsory under Registration Act 1908. If the value of the property is 100 or above. If the value is less than 100, there is an exception. But if the value is more than 100, registration is compulsory for immovable property. The next one, movable property is subjected to general sales tax, state concern, or central sales tax, etc. So there is again taxes applicable to movable property, but it is not the other tax, but the tax is general sales tax, central excise kind of tax, etc. But the registration is not compulsory. Now immovable property, it is not subject to sales tax but liable for stamp duty under Indian Stamps Act 1899 and registration fee under Indian Registration Act 1908. So here, as we are all want to be budding lawyers, if any incident comes, we should know whether we should register it or should not register it. That only we can decide if you know that thing is movable or immovable property. I hope this lecture helped you to identify anything that you see is a movable or immovable. And if you really understand this lesson, please give a like, and you need to share it with all your friends, all those who find difficulty in understanding concepts. And please subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, you can also write it as a comment. I'll be replying it to it. Okay, thank you.